Greetings, good people. Welcome back to another edition of Leaders and Learners, where we all know that the best leaders are lifetime learners. And today we are joined by such a fan, Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. He's a cultural critic, he's an author, he is a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor, of Duke University. As the host of Left of Black and a leading voice in hip hop studies and Black masculinity, Dr. Neal challenges the way that we think about race, gender, and pop culture. From the Bronx to the academy, his work bridges the streets and the classroom. Okay. So get ready for a powerful discussion of culture, community, and critical Black thought. Welcome, Dr. Mark Neal. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well today, Tanya. Thank you for the invitation.
I am so thrilled to have you for a couple reasons. I think there's questions that only you, someone like you, can answer. Okay. And one of the first ones, though, is about anti intellectualism. It feels like we're in a moment right now where people are not talking about higher education and promoting things like reading, critical thought, the processing of information, just being smart. That used to be a thing.
Yeah.
But now anti intellectualism is a thing. And I want you to help us wrap our minds around how we even got here.
We live in a content driven society. It's how people get information, it's how they get entertained. And 100 years ago, the primary content delivery system were books. It's what you read. 100 years ago, there were very few people who had phonographs, what we would call record players when we were growing up. Very few people could afford to go to the movies, and it's not like there were 100 movies released in a year, and there was no television yet.
Mm.
So reading was the primary way that folks got information. Now that we're now in the 21st century and everybody's plugged in and you get all the content you need, you just pick up your phone or your handheld device, people have gotten away from reading. And, it's sad in a couple of ways because, reading, besides getting information, right, it's a process, right? It's a tactile experience. It's a way that your mind thinks and processes information in reading that's not passive, right? When you watch TV, that's a passive experience. When you go to the movies, that's a passive experience. Reading and writing dictates a certain kind of agency in the way that you're learning information. And we're getting further and further away from that. And as we get further and further away from that, generally people don't have the capacity to distinguish good information from bad information. They don't have the capacity to be able to tell whether or not the information they're getting is true or disinformation or misinformation. So it's a really challenging time, for those of us who quote unquote live the life of the mind. And I'd like to disabuse of the idea that to be an intellectual, you have to have a PhD or degrees and be associated with these elite institutions. Many of the folks I grew up with who didn't have college educations, I thought of as intellectuals because they were very thoughtful about how they processed the world.
I have another thought to go along with this of someone that looks like us asked me why would they still promote higher education in college to their kids when they can just go to trade school. You can be successful at trade school. And I literally almost fought someone for telling my son, hey, you don't have to go to college, be a plumber. And that fool was about to drop out of Sarah Lawrence College and go, I can be a successful plumber. Boy, if you don't listen, I'm one that tries to connect the dots. And it feels like we're in a moment where Black women are some of the most educated people in our country. And now all of a sudden it's convenient to tell people to go to trade school.
Mhm.
Do you think there's a correlation or am I just making this up in my mind?
If I'm going to be truthful, there's also always a segment of the population that is not, I don't want to say they're not suitable for college, but college might not be the best choice for them. I have two daughters, one who graduated from college and one who didn't do well in college, but found her way in the world, in terms of a particular trade, and she had to get a license and all those kinds of things. So college is not built for everybody. That part I get about it.
Yep.
I think about it. But there are folks who do have the capacity to be successful in college and more importantly, successful beyond college. Much of the research, groundbreaking research that occurs in this country, in 2025, a lot of it occurs on college campuses. And it's that way that undergraduate students are working with graduate students who are working with professors who are working with both federal entities, but also commercial and private entities to generate new research. You think about the role of vaccines in our society in this period of time. A lot of that research is occurring on college campuses, right? And so Black students should have the capacity and at least have the forefront and the vision to think that they can be successful in these outlets. Now, I'm not saying all of them are going to go into the sciences and make cancer discoveries, but there's so much other work to be done in terms of history and literature, sociology, psychology. I mean, there's so many different tools and trades and learning apparatuses that folks that can get from a college education that's very different than a trade school.
And what about the things that you get from college that aren't just in the books? The life experience, the opportunity to build your own community and your own network and grow as a human being. Like, are they missing that? Are
You
people
know,
really
I
missing that?
I wouldn't give up on my college experience for anything, right?
Man,
What
talk
what I
about
be
it.
what I what I became in the world, not even in terms of what I do professionally, but just as a person and the relationships that I build and being able to run student organizations where I learned how to run organizations, right? Where I learned how to build and navigate tensions. I learned how to work and collaborate with other people. I mean, those are all lessons I learned on college campuses that had I not gone to college, it's a skill set I wouldn't have now.
And I guess that's my question is, why is that not translating? What is it about our conversation about going to college and becoming someone that is successful in higher education that we are missing and not communicating to the next generation? Because independence, resilience, being a problem solver, those are all things that I don't see happening with a lot of people that didn't go to
Yeah.
college. I'm just going to keep it a buck.
Yeah. I mean, let's be clear. That's a conversation that doesn't start in 10th and 11th grade when folks are deciding that they don't want to go to college, right? This is a conversation that starts very much earlier, particularly when we talk about young Black men and Black boys and their experiences in school, where they're not nurtured to be learners, where boys, frankly, have a very different learning style than girls. And schools very rarely have accommodated to the needs of young boys in the classroom, especially Black boys in the classroom, to allow them to be able to learn. So by the time you get to Black boys that are fifth and sixth grade, they simply don't like school, right? And the idea of spending another 12 years, right, or another 8 or 10 years in school is something that doesn't interest them, right? And when they find that they have a trade, there's something they can do with their hands or even stuff that they can do with their minds that they don't have to get a college education with. And there's a pathway towards that.
Yeah.
Many of our young men choose that pathway.
Yeah, I hear you. And speaking of college, Mr. Phi Beta Sigma man, how did you wind up making that choice?
So I actually made that choice much later in my life and my career. I went to an undergraduate school that actually did not have any D9 organizations, right? So it wasn't even an option for me,
Right.
to pursue that, when I was an undergrad. But my wife is a Zeta, and she kind of forced me into the family, if you will. So I pursued Phi Beta Sigma as a member of Delta Zeta Sigma (DZS), which is the Durham alumni chapter here in Durham, North Carolina. I got to shout them out. And it's been an honor to be a part of the Brotherhood for the last 5 years.
What has been your most memorable experience since you've been a member?
For me collectively, I came through right at the beginning of COVID, and the way that the chapter got together, right, to make sure individually all of us survived, but the way that we organize to make sure that we could be impactful in the community here in Durham, supporting Black businesses, supporting each other when we needed to, supporting other D9 organizations, supporting the undergraduate students who we're in contact with. That was the reason why I got involved. I love the parties and the hanging out, and I'm well past the age that I'm going to be doing anybody strolling. Um, but it was this idea of having an institution, a group of men, and increasingly women that I could work with to be able to do impactful work in the community. That's been my most lasting and important impression of being a member of Phi Beta Sigma.
I love to hear it. It actually is in alignment with the work that you were already doing.
Hmm.
And I think it was a great choice for both the organization and you,
Thank you.
obviously, and your
Thank you.
wife. She's
Thank you.
smart. You know, I'm a little biased. I don't know. But with that being said, I definitely want to talk more about your work because a word that has come up a lot in this last election, because the LGBTQ community is always at the center of our elections these days, whatever that's about. There are people that want to focus more on masculinity, and you've described your work as exploring illegible Black masculinities. Can you unpack what that means and why it's so critical in today's cultural landscape?
I wanted to be clear that when we talked about Black men, there's are ways that Black men and boys, Black masculinity, is legible to people. It's something that they understand. So, for instance, if you see a Black male between the ages of 12 and 24 walking down the block bouncing a basketball, right? In any context, you don't give a second thought about that image, right? Because that's something that's so ingrained in your mind, right? Black ball players being the best ball players, and Black men play basketball, and they've excelled exceptionally within that space. But you take any of those same Black men that you saw with the basketball, and that same Black man is walking down the block with a violin,
Hmm.
that gives you a reason to pause, right? And so I wanted to talk about Black masculinity in a way that we unpack why so many images of Black men seem familiar to us that we're comfortable with, and how these other images of Black masculinity, as real as those other images are, make us feel more uncomfortable, or even feel as though it's an image of Black masculinity that's inauthentic. So that's really what I wanted to get at. I have a big thing, throughout that runs throughout my work, whether it was my book, New Black Man, or Looking for Leroy, which you just referenced, about we need to make sure that Black men and boys are comfortable in the skins that we're in. We create these little boxes, right? And we're saying, we say to Black men and boys that to be a real Black man, or to be a real Black boy, you have to fit the contours of this box, right? And if you don't fit the box, right, there's something suspect about you. Right. And that includes conversations that we're having about Black men who are queer, Black men who are bisexual, but generally any kind of Black men in terms of how they dress and their style, their hair, and all these kinds of things. Black men have to be much more comfortable in the skin that we're in if we're going to survive America, and the world at this point in time.
How does your philosophy fit into a culture where our own Black men are having an issue with the gay agenda?
So let's be clear.
I'm sorry, the perceived gay
The
agenda.
perceived gay agenda.
Yes.
Let me be clear. American society in general has failed men and boys.
Amen.
We have not given men and boys the options or the off ramps to be comfortable in who they are, right? They have to stay to the same script over and over again, right? And the script in and of itself that we embrace as real masculinity in American society is one that's toxic. It is patriarchal. It is misogynistic. It is homophobic. It does not see women as one example, as partners and collaborators in their life.
Mm.
And at the same time, the reality is that, particularly when we talk about Black men and boys, there are structural difficulties that are real, right? The impact that white supremacy has on the lives of Black men and boys is not a fiction. That's real, right? The unemployment rates that we see as they are attached to Black men and boys, all those things are real. So we have to find ways to help Black men navigate structural realities that are against them, as opposed to seeing those structural impediments coming from Black men who might be queer, or the women in their life, or women who they see are just much more successful. One of the problems I think we have in this moment in particular is that, you know, Black men and boys, particularly Black men, they don't have community, if that makes sense. You know, in the way that from the time that I was really, really young, and my father and my mother could drop me off at a barber shop, and I'd sit there for an hour and a half, and I'd be exposed to this wide range of Black men with different perspectives, right? You know, it was part of what socialized me. It was part of what raised me. And I'm not saying that those spaces still don't exist, but too many of our young Black men, you know, those folks who are under 30, you know, their whole life is on their phone, you know, in chat rooms, listening to podcasts, not actually having interactions with other people. And you know, we're created a situation now where men in general, but Black men in particular, are seemingly isolated from society, and are sitting around and ruminating on all the things that are wrong and that they're angry about. And some of this anger is legit. I
Yeah.
get all of that, right? But the targets of that can't be successful Black women. The targets of that can't be a Black woman who happens to be married to a white man who's running for president, right? That's not the reason why what's happening to you is happening to you. You know, and it's in that same token that we see, you know, Black men, because of this large history, feel comfortable closing ranks around someone like Sean Combs, closing ranks around someone like R. Kelly, right? And I never
Mm.
thought I'd ever say this, but closing ranks around someone like Smokey Robinson,
Mm.
right? You know, and it's again not to deny that there's a brutal history of anti-Black violence directed towards Black men, in which Black men have been unfairly accused of all kinds of heinous acts. That reality is that reality. But at the same time, there are Black men who engage in problematic and criminal behavior within Black communities, directed towards queer Black folks, directed towards women and girls. And we need to hold those folks accountable also.
When you just said you never thought you'd hear yourself saying that, talk to me about what it feels like to be from a generation that we're from and then have to confront the realities of people that we held dear in our culture. Like what is that to you? What,
It's shocking, but it's not shocking, right? You know,
ooh,
we
painful?
we we grew up in an era in which, you know, our Instagram, you know, was Jet magazine.
Man.
Right? You know, our Instagram, our TikTok was Ebony magazine. We only had access to so much information, right? So there's all kinds of stuff that were going on that we never knew, right? That we would never know because of that. But in the media environment that we're in now, where we know everything about everybody 5 seconds after it happens, you know, it can be a little crushing sometimes when folks that, you know, you just thought of in a certain kind of light are certainly revealed in certain kinds of ways. You're like, oh, damn. Right. And I think we just have to come to terms with the fact that we're all human. We all make mistakes. None of us are in a position of judgment, but judgment is not the same as accountability. Right. And so we still have to hold people accountable, you know, to be good human beings, to be decent, right? To not engage in behavior that necessitates criminal trials and what have you.
I think it's just been heartbreaking on so many levels to see the reality of inhumanity, I
Yeah,
guess you would say,
yeah,
that some people that we've held in high regard,
yeah,
to see how low they can fall. after we've held them so high.
And but the crazy part of it is that there are other examples of folks who do this also, and it doesn't tarnish their reputation at all, right? They can be elected president twice,
Mm.
you know, as one example of
And how painful is that? Jesus Christ.
that.
Hey, by the way, how are things where you are? What is the political climate like? Are you feeling it, or is everything just, you guys are just living and acting like what's going on ain't going on?
No, I mean, I think we're all feeling it, if not out of fear and anticipation of what could happen. No matter how much many of these institutions talk about the fact that they're going to defend their mission. For someone like me, who has been committed to Black studies for 30 years, I'm always under the understanding that Black studies or women and gender studies are things that are going to be targeted, even in the best of times, right? And this clearly is not the best of times. But I think one of the ways that we feel it is that, because this is a government that is walking away from its commitments to support research,
Mm.
right? And many institutions, particularly alien institutions, are significantly leveraged by the amount of research money that they get through NIH and other sources coming into universities. And when universities start to think about the fact that there are going to be a 500 million or $700 million shortfall, right? That they don't necessarily have the capacity to backstop, right? That's going to reverberate throughout the institution in terms of folks unfortunately losing jobs and early retirements, and you hope you're able to still maintain viable academic departments and units within their context. But as it is so early in the process now, I think people are really driven by fear and anticipation of the worst.
Dr. Neal, listen, from your roots in the Bronx to Duke
Mhm.
University,
Mhm.
how have your roots shaped the way that you approach cultural critique and scholarship? How did you even get on this path?
So I'm on this path because of my daddy.
Okay.
My daddy, Arthur C. Neal Jr., who would have celebrated his 90th birthday on May 5th, 2 days ago.
Mm. Oh, he's a
He
tourist,
Yeah, he was a
a
Taurus.
stubborn tourist.
My dad was a functional illiterate. He dropped out of school in 10th grade, never really learned how to read. Somehow managed to navigate from Augusta, Georgia, where he was born, to move up to New York, where he met my mom and they raised me. But he always kept with him this love of music. And that
Mm.
was the thing that he passed on to me very early in my life. Love of music and baseball. Those were the two things that we bonded over, listening to music and watching New York Mets baseball games. And it was that love of music that he ingrained at me at a very, very young age that I'm now privileged, to be in a position to teach and research about, right? So, I got interested in this because of my dad. But by the same token, I had a mother who was adamant about me going to college, right? There was never a question, to your earlier point. For my generation, for my mother's generation, my parents' generation, like, the mark of how successful they could be as a parent was for their children to be able to do and achieve things they never had the opportunity to, right? And my mom, took this challenge at face value and started college a year before I did. We were in college at the same time, two different institutions, right? But she's like,
Wow.
if I'm going to demand this of you, I'm also going to demand this of myself. So education was always an important pathway for me. What has been the big thing for me as I've made the transition from the South Bronx to a place like Duke, I never in my career wanted to forget the everyday Black folks who raised me to be the person that I was. I always wanted to do research and scholarship, for instance, that my father would find value in, that people like my father would find value in. And, when things get a little tense here around Duke, right, for instance, and I'm sitting around tables in which few of the people around the table look like me, I lean in on those folks. I lean on the place where I came from because I know that where I come from represents a perspective that the folks around the table need to hear.
Mm.
That my perspective, given where I came from and the people who produced me, is a challenge to their worldview, right? And as I've ascended to certain, levels of success and achievement, it's a responsibility on me, right, to
Absolutely.
make sure that I represent those perspectives, when they need to be represented in that context.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm.
You co-teach a course, if I'm not mistaken, the history of hip hop with Ninth Wonder, right?
Yeah. So,
Is that
so
right?
I we did it together for 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. We co-taught it together.
Okay.
When some of my administrative duties got a little bit more busier here at Duke, he's been doing the class himself for the last 5 years. But that was such a wonderful partnership. I first met Patrick Doubt at Ninth Wonder when I got here to Duke. I, of course, was familiar with him, right, because of the work he had done with Little Brother, and of course, producing for Jay-Z. And we met at a radio station, a public radio station. They wanted to talk a little bit about hip hop, so they brought the two of us together. And before we even got on the air, we had a conversation about being girl dads.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a conversation about our favorite hip hop song, which is Pete Rock and CL Smooth's They Reminisce Over You. And from that moment on, we were fast friends.
I love
Um,
it.
so, he was teaching in North Carolina Central at the time, HBCU here in Durham, Go Eagles. And, when he had an opportunity, to come over to Duke to co-teach, we made that happen, and we did it for 10 years. And it was for me, such a great experience. And for the students who benefited from it, sometimes the class was as large as 140 students and as quiet as it's kept. In a lot of cases, the Black students were actually the minority students in the class.
Right.
It was always more white students and South Asian students and Asian students that were in the class because they loved hip hop too. And so, they got to hear from Ninth the experience of being an artist, right? To
Right.
hear about some of the technical aspects of it. And then I would color in the cultural history, the historical context for hip hop and other things. So it was such a great teaching experience. And to the moment, I actually miss, being in the classroom at night.
Mm. What are you doing now?
What am I doing now? So
What are you doing?
I'm ending my term now as chair of the Department of African American Studies here at Duke. I've been chair since 2017. It's been wonderful service. I've been happy, to work with my colleagues and build the strongest department that we can,
Mm.
in this environment. And I'm segueing now to the head of Duke's Faculty Senate, which a very, very important role and one of the highest faculty positions here at Duke. So I'm looking forward to doing that work, particularly as the faculty works with Duke to get through the crisis that we're in at this moment.
We're just going to call this time period a crisis. We are in crisis. Dear Lord help us. We are in crisis.
Existential crisis, definitely. Yes.
Listen, personally, I struggle keeping myself from going nuclear and unhinged with every little thing that comes out. Okay, not every little thing, but there are some things I know that probably get under your skin and you just want to let off. So, how does someone in your position deal with some of the angst that a lot of this crisis is causing, and stay professional? Or do you? Is there a time? Are you code switching? Like, how are you living these days? Because your wife is a Zeta, so I can't assume that she's silent or demure because we get a little unhinged. I think only alpha women play Zeta. Sorry, D9, I could be wrong, but tell me how you living through this outside of the classroom. Like, what is your social life? How do you process this stuff personally?
So, on some level, the way that we've been bombarded with stuff was the point. Right. It
Right.
was
Okay.
intended,
I got
right,
that.
to
I got that.
just unleash so much on us that we wouldn't know how to handle it.
Absolutely.
And I think when you expected that to be the case, you pause and you pay attention to the stuff you need to pay attention to. and you don't pay attention to stuff that probably was just out there to confuse you in the first place. But I'm a 59-year-old black man from the Bronx. My whole life has been code switching, right? And I'm not a small man, right? So, I understand how my presence in rooms, or black men like me, that our presence in rooms, you know, moves people in a certain kind of way, right? And so we have to be able to navigate that, right? So, you're very careful, at least I am, in terms of when I talk, right? And it's not that I don't have an interest in talking, but I'm really interested in listening. It's like the Obama thing, right? They never can see the angry Mark Anthony Neal, right? Until they need to see it,
until they need to see
if
it.
that makes sense, right? So
Absolutely.
I always want to reserve the fact to go off, on occasion, right? But you have to be very deliberate and strategic about that. So the way that I kind of unpack, walking, listening to music, watching baseball, watching basketball. I'm a Knicks fan, so we're happy to take game one from the Celtics, and all those kinds of things. And again, to be able to lean in on the brotherhood here. My brother's in Phi Beta Sigma.
Mm.
My wife and I have been married now for 34 years. So that's been an ongoing building relationship, and we got a grandson now, right? So it's all those kinds of things. Like when I get too stressed, I pick up my phone and pull up a photo of my almost 2-year-old grandson, and I'm good in that moment,
Okay.
right? But
Okay.
but it is a very difficult thing, because this is the reality of it, right? I mean, we're all joking aside, you know. Stress kills black people, right?
Amen.
Stress kills black men, right? And we cannot let these folks kill us, right? They're trying to kill us all the time, right? And I'm talking about all the kind of structural and other reality things, right? But in our day-to-day professional lives, we can't allow these folks to kill us, right? So we have to know when to kind of unplug, right? And not take the bait, right? And be really strategic in terms of how we utilize our anger and our rage, and things of that nature.
I appreciate you sharing that. So for all you people out there that be losing your shit often, you know what I'm saying? Like take a breath, find something that can untrigger you because
Mm.
trying to remove Harriet Tubman and then acting like the Underground Railroad was just where we met up to kick it. That was crazy to me. That was crazy,
Yeah.
but okay. How has hip hop evolved for you as both an art form and a social movement since you first encountered it?
So I have multiple hip hop stories, right? Because if you're
Anyway,
asking me about hip hop in 2025, I don't even really know what you're talking about.
like, who are
Right,
these
right.
people?
Who are these people? What is this music, right? But I also say that understanding that it is not music and culture that is intended for me at this point in time. Right. So I can feel comfortable saying I don't like it because it's not really intended for me. But, coming from where I came from growing up in the South Bronx, and remembering hip hop when it was just in the park, right? And you just had a bunch of MCs and a DJ, and they were plugged into the light post, and it was very, very organic and community based. The fact that it would grow to become the $1 billion business that it is, the fact that we would legitimately talk about the way that hip hop elected a president or two,
Hmm.
right, in the last 20, 25 years, the fact that so many people like myself who were raised on hip hop are professors and lawyers and MDs and geneticists, and we could go on, right? It was hip hop who told us that what we imagined in the world was possible,
Could happen. Yep.
right? And it did that, right? And it created billionaires and millionaires and all this kind of stuff. The challenge, of course, is that once you have that level of success, there's a level of responsibility that comes with it.
Yeah.
And I'm not all sure those folks who were leaders in hip hop in terms of the culture and the business side of it and all those kinds of things, not all of them were really prepared for what responsibility meant in this context,
Yeah.
right? Everybody loves a good party, right? But hip hop at this stage can't just be about, shouldn't have been just about party and bullshit. I loved all the images I saw in the Met Gala, right? And loved that hip hop was represented at the Met Gala, right? But hip hop came from the hood, working class people. What is hip hop doing for the hood and working class people
Right.
now? And I know that's not solely hip hop's responsibility. I get that, right? But those were issues that seemed to be much more in sync for what hip hop was for me 25 and 30 years ago than it is in 2025.
Whew. Yeah, you said a word. Um, I don't know who half of these people are. I am not. I don't like it. It's just it don't feel good. Like it's hard
Yeah.
to listen to. It's very
Yeah. Yeah.
cringy. You feel like, ugh, I need to take a shower after Sunday. You don't understand what is going on. And then I have teenagers. My kids range from 24 down to 14, and I get excited when my oldest will play like a Hall and Oates or a Luther
Yep. Yep.
Vandross. That makes me incredibly happy. Like I literally feel like a good parent. Okay. And then my 16-year-old will play, Whitney or something like that. And I'm like, oh, I'm not that bad of a parent. But then he'll turn around and put on some ratchetness that I don't even
And you can't
even
even listen to.
decipher
Yeah.
it. And then when I do, I'm mad that I even know what they're saying. It's hard. Listen, it's hard. But let me ask you about your show, Left of Black.
Yeah.
You center Black intellectuals and artists. Has the platform influenced your understanding of storytelling and representation in the digital age? Or are you trying to put more of your influence into the digital age?
It's kind of a both end. I mean, we've been
Okay.
doing Left of Black for 15 years. The first episode hit in September 2010. There was no Zoom. As one example, we were using Skype in those early days and set up a TV, a giant monitor next to me. So it was if I was talking to someone in the studio. It was something that the technology at the time allowed because we didn't have money to be bringing people to campus and flying them in and all that kind of stuff. And so we just kind of rolled with the punches, right? It was definitely an experiment in the early days, but one of the things I was really committed to doing is that there were so few places in the culture, Black culture and American culture more broadly, that took seriously the work of Black thinkers.
Mhm.
The famous people got shine, right? So everybody knew who Cornel West was, or Mike Eric Dyson, or Bell Hooks, Ta-Nehisi Coates. But there are a lot of folks who weren't going to be on NPR or PBS or the CBS morning show that were doing extraordinary work, and we wanted to allow them a platform to talk about their work, to talk about their books. And it's been a joy because I've been able to see and talk to folks who were, for instance, in graduate school when we started, who talk about, when I was in graduate school, I couldn't wait to write my first book so I could be on Left of Black.
Mm.
Number of folks who've told me that, I'm familiar with this person's work, or, my professor showed this episode in class. I mean, the whole thing was to be able to cut through, would it take to bridge the gap between what we're doing in the academy on these campuses and folks who could access it, right? So it's always important for us to be someplace accessible and free, like YouTube, right? That you didn't have to pay for it, right? That you can sit there and listen to it. We also wanted, it's before podcasts, right? So, we call our thing now a video podcast because we thought the images were just as important as the conversation that you were hearing, right?
Yeah.
So there was a certain kind of film quality, right, that we had to it. And my favorite story about what we wanted to do with Left of Black and what we've been able to achieve, really, really early in the process, we were fortunate to do an episode with Cornel West, and it still remains our most watched episode. And I was literally online at KFC one day, and dude turned around and said, "You look familiar. Oh, you were on that show with Cornel West." And for me, that was the moment. right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we wanted. We didn't want this just to be something that other intellectuals watch or that they made their students to watch, but everyday Black folks who have an interest in the things that we are also interested in, who wouldn't have to come on campus and try to find parking and feel like they don't belong.
Right.
Left of Black was always intended to make sure that everybody belonged.
Yep. I love that. And for those of you that have not already started and engaged with this platform, please do. Like, we need to get back to a space where being smart and intellectual, even if it's not going to college, is a thing. Like, it has to be
Yeah,
a thing.
yeah.
Growing up in a Black home, it was always told, you are not white, so don't be acting white. That also, what that really meant was, we do things different, and my
Yeah.
expectations of you are different. And I tell my kids all the time, my expectations of you will never change. I don't care what this society changes. My
Hmm.
expectations of you and your expectations of yourself should never change. So I do hope that we get back to a place where being an intellectual, being thoughtful, being strategic in our moves
Right,
becomes
right.
a thing again, and not just for some of us, but again for all of us and the people that we are raising. Hello. So listen, before I let you go, I want to ask you, looking forward, what gives you hope about the next generation of scholars, artists, activists engaging in Black culture and identity?
The next generation has so much more access to information than any previous generation that's existed on this earth. And I hope they take advantage of the information that they have. The fact that as a Black community, we can openly talk about LGBTQT figures in our community, that with Black Lives Matter, even though there were some rough points, we understood that, for instance, 3 Black lesbian women could be leaders.
Mhm.
I think this generation is so past the old conversations about sexuality and gender that it's going to allow them to be able to build organizations and collaborations in the future that we could not have imagined in the past, right? Because we were so caught up in some of these other divisions. So some of that stuff makes me really, really hopeful.
Glad to hear it. And I want to wish your Knicks good luck, but not better luck than the Warriors. And if you happen to be a Mets fan, I can't wait until the Giants beat their tail. But, and if you like to wager at all, then let me know and we can figure that out too. But I do want to, are you a football fan? You didn't say anything about football because the 49ers are
you
happy to
know,
beat anybody
I
you like.
so this is the thing about football. Um, my favorite football team is the New York Jets.
Okay.
And you can't say that out loud.
Not
We
with
ain't
who
been to,
y'all
we
had
ain't
as
been to the
quarterback.
Super Bowl since 1969. Um, but I am honestly, I am more of a basketball and baseball person.
That sounds like someone that's afraid to say that they're a Clippers fan instead of a Lakers fan, but y'all need therapy. All y'all need therapy. Oh my God. Let the people know how they can continue to follow your work, support what you're doing, and just keep up with your journey because it is so interesting.
Well, definitely watch Left of Black. You can follow me on Twitter at New Black Man. You can follow me on IG at Booker BB Brown. And so, just check out the stuff that I've been doing. You mentioned the Diddy documentary. I also was fortunate to be in Questlove's Sly Lives documentary, which was a
Saw
lot of
that too.
fun.
That was great.
And I'm hoping I can come back on, when my next book on Black fatherhood is done next year.
Absolutely. It's a date. I love it. And can you
Yes,
please let my Sora know? She's the best.
I will do
I
that.
know she
Thank
has
you.
her hands full, bless her heart. But you guys, thank you for being here, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Tanya.
Hey, thanks for showing up to the podcast where we all know that the best leaders are lifetime learners. When you get a sec, take a moment, leave a comment. What you think about today's episode? And share it with someone that you know could use the gems that were dropped today. Follow and subscribe. You don't want to miss who's coming up next. You never know who could show up here and what they could say. For your professional needs, marketing, PR, communications, and leadership, Make sure you follow us on all social media platforms at Sand and Shores, or hit us up at sandandshores.com. Again, thanks so much for showing up. We appreciate you, and we'll see you soon.